Good morning, everyone, in this wonderful setting. Thank you for coming from far and wide. Thank you, distinguished panelists. It's a great pleasure and honor. And I also have to say, underline, because I've been told about 10 times by now that we need to be on time. This is such a very interesting topic that we could go on. Actually, when I started compiling questions for distinguished panelists, I reached about 30, and I said, it's not gonna fly. We could go all day. It's the region we're talking about, the security challenges for it is actually not such a big piece of real estate, but it did cause a lot of problems, gave a lot of good to the world throughout history. And I love that quote, that Balkans suffer from too much history. But it did cause a lot of problems, and it can also change how the landscape. Can you imagine, just a thought crossed my mind yesterday, if there were no wars in the 90s, well, the European Union would have been looking very different. So today we have a couple of questions that we'll focus on. I would like to hear from our panelists in a quick intro. What are the challenges really today? How can they be successfully met? And what would happen in the case of failure? So let's start and then take it from there. We'll talk about the elephant in the room and other stuff that are obvious problems. Madam Ambassador.
Okay. So I'll start with the obvious challenges. Your remark about history certainly obtains here, and probably it's a good idea to look forward. That's the theme of this gathering in any case. So challenges in the region. Well, I think there are good things happening, and there are things that are not happening, and the not happening is probably where we get the list of challenges. Having just had this agreement on the North Macedonian name, I think what we hope to get is some momentum to resolve other problems ongoing. Among those, I would put the situation in Bosnia, which actually needs some attention and needs an example like this of local leaders working out their problems in a way in which eventually the populations are consulted and they accept. Another obvious overhanging problem is the relationship between Kosovo and Serbia, where we have had ongoing discussions for quite a long time. And something interesting about that one, when I first heard about it, I thought in this discussion of possibly changing borders, land swaps, and so on, my first reaction as sort of an old-time Balkans hand is, no, 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 this is exactly what we don't want to have happen. But when I started thinking about it, I thought, well, you know what? This is a different situation from others that we've had, because we're talking about making an agreement between two sides, and if the two sides accept it and their populations accept it, then that's something quite different from other kinds of situations where there's a border involved. If the population accepts it on both sides, then it seems to me that it's probably a good step forward. And in my mind, resolving that one would certainly create a whole different dynamic in the region.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I agree with that. There is, if I may just add to this, there is, especially in Serbia, sort of the idea that just by resolving the border or this agreement will happen, and it will focus just on that. Actually, what is needed is a sort of a Dayton-type peace accord, which is not 2 pages, 5 pages, it's about 500 pages, that deals with all sorts of issues, political, religious, economic, financials, property issues, rule of law and all that. So if I agree, if that's, and not many some actually in Europe don't. But if that's the step forward, that's perfect. Mr. President.
Thank you and good morning, everyone.
With my right.
I'm very, very excited to be here with you to share this wonderful view of the mountains to a very beautiful nature. And I'm here just because of one very important reason, I think, that just to thank the government of Greece, the Prime Minister, the government, the state of Greece, of what they've done with the Prespa Treaty. It's exciting to see how politicians could think beyond short-sighted political interests, beyond the partisan games. It's very exciting to see peacemaking at its best. And thank you. It's wonderful to be here in a moment we see history is made in a very positive way, and people on the Balkans accept that very much. So congratulations of what happened with the Prespa Treaty. We're all very excited, and we think it sets up a new agenda again on the Balkans, and it's the agenda of coming together in an attempt not just for peace, but for a lasting peace. And lasting peace is only possible if we think beyond borders, if we solve issues that sometimes are stuck for decades and centuries, and if we stood on the very strong foundation of the truth about history, for example, which now North Macedonia, of course, has to face. And I think the government there is brave enough, beyond the propaganda of gone back into history, empire thinking of, I would say, artificial empire, which then broke, to the very sound foundations of how do we come together in the Balkans in an attempt for a lasting peace in the 21st century. Of course, today we're talking about the problems, and I would mention three of them. The first one is, of course, Bosnia-Herzegovina. The second one is the Serbia-Kosovo debacle, and the third one is, I would point at Russia as probably a very important factor to talk a bit to what are the intentions and what we have seen on the ground on the Balkans so far. So very quickly about Bosnia-Herzegovina. Something is cooked there, something happens, it's very dangerous. Mr. Dodik always points, and whenever it's difficult, again, he even makes it even as a stronger case that they want to have a referendum on splitting Republic of Srpska to Bosnia-Herzegovina. This is a nuclear bomb. This is just a ticking drama. I talked to many presidents, my colleagues in the region, for this period of time, as I was head of state of Bulgaria 2012, 2017, and that was a nightmare to all of us. The president of Croatia or the president of even Macedonia, now more Northern Macedonia, I'm sorry. And so, why is that? Because of a very simple reason that if Republic of Srpska splits away, the other two, they don't know how to divide. There is no way. It's so mixed. And potential tensions are coming big time. The Republic of Srpska is putting that, but also a lot of activities goes on there beyond the table, I would say, and that's extremely dangerous. Serbia, Kosovo, we talked about that. In the beginning, I didn't thought it's a nice and a good idea to start talking about moving borders. I think that the time has come for us to think beyond borders, and I think that Balkans borders should fall and should not be moved, as we have seen a very positive development back in the 80s, the 70s in Western Europe because of falling of borders, because of integrating, because of enjoying coming together, connecting together, and even producing, trading, and living together in a wonderful attempt. So I don't think this is going to fly. I'm not optimistic about raising the issue. I think there is much more propaganda and less, let's say, a sustainable solution. But sooner or later, Serbia has to face, on one side, its growing nationalism, and on the other side, the pressing issue of deciding who they are, where do they want to go, because just I talk so many times to presidents, prime ministers of Serbia, and they're always telling me I will just give you one example. We were in the United Nations and we were expecting for the speeches of heads of state to come. And I was sitting next to the President Nikolic and then Chancellor Merkel, some other politicians, and the President of Serbia was telling me, Mr. President, now I will listen to my big brother. And I said, okay, but, and then the Chancellor Merkel, actually, she asked, okay, but why don't you listen to me? I'm not your big brother, but why don't you listen also to our ideas? The President said, Madam Chancellor, I will listen to the President Obama, I'll listen to you with my brain, but I listen to my big brother with my heart. And this solution, this situation we have today, that Serbia is really on one side, let's say, pushing very hard Russian interests on the Balkans. On the other side, saying we want to go to the European Union, we want to integrate with the West, by knowing that today we have a very tough situation of, I would say, the European Union and the West from one side and Russia on the other side, being confronted and being opponents and seeing how Russia is trying to divide and weaken the European Union big time with a lot of efforts. So by saying this, Serbia faces very tough choices to be made in the future, and I think we will monitor very carefully the situation. Just a number of words about Russia. We have seen, for example, Russia trying to destabilize Montenegro in front of our eyes, trying to bring down a legitimate elected government. We should never forget that. We have seen also how President Putin have been received in Belgrade as a king, as a Tsar. It was very impressive to see that. And I was very proud, by the way, that on the other side in Sofia, exactly in the very same day, President Putin came to Serbia with a big wow. The Bulgarian government decided to buy F-16s. So I find it very exciting. I find very exciting this just very same moment of truth in history. So you see how diverse the Balkans are, and I was also very proud. This is the way I'm going to finish my introductory words. I was very proud also as the chairman of the high-level format of the Bulgarian presidency of the European Council. I was very proud to see an attempt of coming together by all the leaders without just naming one or two of them, but all of them. I was very positive. I was very proud and very big optimist. Let's say positive realist, but optimist in a way that everybody in the region, no matter NATO or not NATO member state, European or not European member state, agreed to connect, to bring together our gas pipelines, our networks, our highways, our railways, in a common attempt of coming together. And I think the results will be very, very, very visible. And the Bulgarian presidency contributed, but we should never forget that the Greek presidency and Greece itself for decades was the engine of the European integration of the countries in the region. And again, as a Bulgarian head of state, I want to thank the Greek government for their constant and a very effective support for all the countries in the region to come into the European Union and NATO, which I think is the only way to all of us to create the foundations for a lasting peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. You opened a couple of points there. We'll get back to them. They were on my agenda for sure. The borders, Serbia-Russia relations and Russia's involvement, and I'm really sorry that we do not have a Russian representative on the panel. It'd be good to hear their point of view. Also Turkish, also Chinese.
Yeah. There should be a much bigger panel.
Exactly, and that's why I said we could go on the entire day, because as I said, it's a very small piece of real estate, and right now it's under a lot of influences. And for one, for instance, I'm just going to jump a little bit ahead in the timing. Bosnia-Herzegovina is the best example of exactly what we're saying. Is that it's a battleground. It's not a hot battleground, and God forbid should it ever be. It's a cold battleground between the East and the West, but it's also got involvement of at least 6 Islamic countries, and pardon, Russia, not Russia, Turkey. It's not calling itself Islamic, right? It's Arab. Okay. So, and what do they have in common? These 6 countries, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Kuwait, Qatar, Malaysia, and I'm missing somebody. Iran, of course, Iran. What do they have in common? They all hate the United States. Forget the nice words. They also hate Russia, and they also hate each other. And they're pouring huge amounts of money into Bosnia-Herzegovina, and when you pour money into a place, you want something in return. So you can imagine the enormous conflicting interests, the pull to one side. So it's not easy, but we'll get back to it.
Thank you, Jovan. Jovan and I go back to the fall of 1993 when I was a junior diplomat in Belgrade. He was a dashing young journalist. It's a pleasure to be here with you 26 pounds later. A couple of thoughts, if I may. Each of the issue sets in the Balkans has its own dynamic, and I know we're going to drill down on some of those as we continue in the panel. But in looking at the issue of challenges, I'd like to focus in on 2 significant, large external factors. The first would be, as our Bulgarian colleague pointed out, the role of Russia. In addition to supporting a coup attempt in Montenegro, the Russians have been very aggressive in working to undermine the Prespas Agreement, in goading Milorad Dodik into pursuing a secessionist agenda in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in using the issue of Kosovo as a tool to constrain Belgrade's choices and limit its own freedom of movement on its path towards a European future, where we, the majority of us here in this room, are looking for a Western Balkans region that is predicated on norms and rules and institutions. Moscow is seeking to promote rules of the road in the Western Balkans that are predicated on disorder, distrust, friction. They don't need, in pursuing this agenda, to succeed. What they need is for everybody else to fail. And this is their strategic objective in the Western Balkans, and this is what we must work assiduously against. The other external factor that I would highlight, and I'd be very interested in the thoughts of the other members of the panel on this, is Brussels, frankly, which is our strategy in the Balkans has been based on the idea that what we want is to integrate the region into European and Euro-Atlantic institutions, which means principally NATO and the European Union. The European Union for all of the Western Balkan countries, and NATO for all who aspire to membership, which is at least in principle, all except Serbia, although the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina has gotten a little more complicated. However, from the perspective of the countries in the region, the prospect of membership in, if not NATO, in the European Union seems to be receding. It seems to be harder and harder to achieve that goal as the European Union turns inward on itself, trying to deal with the issue of Brexit, trying to deal with friction between some of the older, what some would call the core members, and some of the newer members in terms of how the Union should function. And until and unless the path forward to membership in the EU is clean and clear and feels achievable to the leaders in the Western Balkans, it will be very hard to incentivize these systems to make the kinds of very difficult political reforms that we want to see them make and that are part and parcel of the EU accession process. So I'm looking here at things like visa liberalization for Kosovo. Because the European Union has been reluctant to offer that to Kosovo, the Kosovars feel that they're not wanted by Europe, that their incentive to make these kinds of reforms and changes that we want them to settle with Serbia is reduced. Opening up accession negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania. The European Union will have a chance to make that decision in June. The United States very much hopes that the decision is to open the negotiations. It's a long process. There's a lot of stages to it. But it's important to incentivize the reform agenda that's at the top of our set of goals and objectives, and one that we share with the European Union. So I'm going to stop there for openers, and then we can get down into particular Serbia, Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Albania issue sets, as you will, Mr. Moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, that's very, very true, that a lot of things would have be much easier to resolve in the Balkans or Southeast Europe if the European Union membership and enlargement is not at the moment stalled. And this is very bad news. And I apologize for those who heard this before, but I keep insisting if for Serbia, and I cannot speak for the government, just so be very clear on this. I'm just an analyst. You know, and I'm taking the example of Serbia. If the membership in the European Union, is the Holy Grail, then the quest for the Holy Grail is perhaps even more important, because that will force us to conduct those reforms that are so very, very necessary in order to make Serbia a valid modern country with institutions that help. And that's not just for Serbia, it's for all the countries. Once you don't have that goal in front of you, then all these reforms are much harder to implement, much harder to galvanize the implementers of the reform. So that is something we'll try to discuss a little bit later.
Well, good morning. Thank you very much, and many thanks for taking my mind off Brexit for at least 60 minutes.
I'm sorry I brought it up.
I've been eating, drinking, sleeping Brexit for the last 3 years, and I think I will be doing for the next 3 years. But thanks for bringing me back to one of my old loves, EU enlargement. When I was Director General for Enlargement in the Commission, we used to say that enlargement is the EU's most successful foreign policy. Some said it was our only successful foreign policy. But I think we could, with a straight face at that time, claim that this was the means whereby the EU could exercise its normative power. Well, today, as we've already gathered from the discussion, we're not so sure. We can't be quite so confident about that anymore. And you asked at the beginning about the major challenges. I would say the major challenges really for the European Union are in this domain, are on the one side to maintain support for this enlargement process, knowing that the member states have in reality gone cold on it for a whole set of reasons, some of which have already been mentioned this morning, the EU's numerous crises, the Brexit problem, many other issues, but also the fact that we have discovered since the last enlargement that the EU's influence over new member states is vastly diminished the moment an accession treaty is signed. And I think EU member states do feel to some extent that they've had their fingers burned. And now we're in a situation where the European Commission is beginning rule of law actions under the EU treaty against member states. Regretfully, years after accession, the very ineffective cooperation and verification procedure is still in place with regard to Bulgaria and Romania. It's frustrating for both sides. On the one side, it has no real teeth, and on the other side, it is seen to call into question, in some sense, full membership and amounting to, in some degree, to some sort of second-class form of membership. So we haven't resolved these issues. And at the same time, we have more and more voices in the member states raising questions. We've been transferring up to 4% of GDP to the new member states, not so new anymore, for 15 years. And yet now we're grappling with the kind of problems that I just mentioned. So this is clearly the background for trying to keep the EU's support for the enlargement process as we go forward. On the side of the partner countries in Southeast Europe, we've already heard about many of the difficulties, the internal difficulties, reform difficulties, which I quite honestly don't think can be attributed simply to the stalling of the process. This is rather chicken and egg. I mean, why is the process stalling? In part because of doubts on the EU side, but in part, as you can read in EU Commission reports, Freedom House reports, reports from objective sources year after year, that the country's own process of reform seems to have stalled too. So the question is, what can we do about this? We don't want to be in this same situation. Commission President Juncker thought that one thing that we could do about it was to give targets and to say, as he did in 2017, there will be new member states after 2019, a rather paradoxical statement. There may well be at some point. And then he proposed a dedicated strategy for Serbia and Montenegro, while at the same time the Commission reported the kind of problems that had been holding back that process, and mentioned a target date, 2025, for their accession. Whereas I think most informed sources believe that it's going to take a decade or so, at least, before we have new member states. So the question is, has the EU got it right? Is it correct to raise hopes, to raise aspirations, to put targets there in front of the countries, really knowing that they can't be reached, but at the same time wanting to affirm our commitment to the process, and also to give a message to others, including Russia and other third countries active in the region, that the EU remains engaged, and yet we know that this is not really realistic. So we have a new team that will be taking over in Brussels, normally, as they say in Belgium. In Belgium, when you say normally, it means you don't really know. We normally expect a new team to take over in Brussels in October, other things being equal. And this will be a real chance to take a fresh look at this area of policy. And already there are discussions in some of our national capitals, in Paris, for example, and elsewhere, about new ideas. I mean, I don't come to you this morning to put on the table any specific new idea, but just to mention one that is circulating. Instead of this sort of endless process of targets which seem implausible and frustration building up, is we could maybe think again about the nature of EU accession. And one idea is to move towards a kind of two-stage membership. And this would work as follows, basically. Of course, if countries are able to fulfill all the conditions, political conditions, democracy, rule of law, human rights, well and good, they can accede as full members in the normal way. But if countries have made progress fulfilling the economic criteria for membership, legal criteria, and so on, according to this idea that is circulating, they could join the EU on a kind of probationary basis with respect to those policy areas that they'd already fulfilled the criteria for, which might well be economic, single market, flanking policies. They would have access to the EU structural funds on a conditional basis, provided they continued to make progress with the political criteria. And then, when they really had a convincing track record that didn't risk going in the other direction as soon as the accession treaty was signed, they would move beyond this probationary status to full membership. I'm just sharing that with you as one of the ideas in circulation that perhaps could figure in our debate.
I think that's an excellent idea, and thank you very much for that, which coincides with what I was meaning to end the panel with. A thought about how to reorganize the entire region in the current situation, but this is perfect, and it's certainly merits a lot of thought. It doesn't mean let's form a commission and sweep it under the rug. Hopefully not. Dr. Ram.
Is it a problem that I don't have a mic?
We can't stretch far enough.
Oh,
Oh, okay.
that's really
Switch.
sorry about that.
I'm the overflow participant. Yeah. Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate your suggestions as to what we can actually do and change, but that is kind of tricky. As a historian, I always like the quip about the Balkans as having too much history for its size. But in a way, over these 25 years that you personally, for instance, have been engaged in that, I think because of this prevalence of historical problems in the region, we somewhat oversaw that or missed that the Balkans were actually a laboratory for the rest of Europe, in that borders and nationalism are very important. And we thought we had that behind us, and the Balkans were an exception or a historical laggard, while at the same time now we have to see that they were ahead of the curve. And we entered that sphere that the Balkans never left. Borders are back in fashion, so I somewhat doubt the president's remarks about just removing borders and then it's finished. Just to move your attention to the very north of Europe, there is a tiny border between Denmark and Germany, 70 kilometers long, which is one of the best integrated regions in Europe. It has a long history of minority problems. There were referenda about where the countries, the regions belong to, and that has been solved in a remarkable effort over decades. And yet, right now, there is a fence being built along these 70 kilometers. It's 1.50 meters high and 50 centimeters deep. And it's there in order to prevent wild boars from going from Germany to Denmark. Good fences make good neighbors is still a sentence that resonates well even in those regions of Europe. And
now good fences make healthy pigs.
right, I'll keep pigs healthy. Right.
The ownership.
So it just to remind you that borders are not out of fashion. It's not easy to get away with that, and very many people, even in those regions, feel that a good border protection is something worthwhile. You don't have to tackle the issue of migration to get that far. Wild boars do the trick as well. So what can we do? Like, momentum is not on our side in that respect, but momentum is of essence. I mean, we just talked about that yesterday, Matthew, that and I'm really grateful for the momentum that the Americans have been providing over the last 25 years in trying to stabilize that region. Well, at the same time, the European commitment was very strong, and we're in that together, and hope we stay in that, because the clock is ticking. And as many problems as we solve in the Balkans, and the North Macedonia one is one, at the same time, the others don't go away, and others come up, as the Russian challenge that was mentioned. So whenever there is a solution, there's another problem coming up, and keeping the pressure on and the determination of everybody involved is the key issue. And we can't do that by just claiming that everything is going according to plan, and we go along. So we have to be creative, and I'm grateful for these comments. If we can solve border issues in a creative way, we should talk about that. And if we can find different means of satisfying the right aspirations of partner nations in the Western Balkans, we should talk about that as well, and not just cling to conventions and agreements that we have been clinging to for 25 years, if we don't want to lose out and lose the momentum that is so important. And I think one of the recommendations that I would want to make, of course, we're having these huge problems with regard to Kosovo and Bosnia, which I would, together with the Russian influence and the increasing one as framing as the most important challenges, we shouldn't just resort to blaming that on politics, because politics is just the twin sister of democracy. Themistocles played politics, Cicero and Cato played politics, and Thaci and Dodik and whoever are doing that too. That's just part of the game, and we have to include that into our balance sheet. As foreign policy makers, we often are inclined to elevate ourselves above the level of politics, but that's part of it, and we have to tackle and accept that and deal with it, and otherwise we would just deny the depth of the problem. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, like this more about the board. I will say something now. Some will consider a little bit blasphemous, if you will. Maybe it's a too strong a word. But I would like to remind you of a fact. I was born in a country that was called Yugoslavia, right? And when you think about it, it's something that Dr. Ralph just mentioned. It was a precursor to the European Union in many ways. It's now got 6 countries that came out of it. They had limited sovereignty, common currency, common foreign policy, and everything. My point being is that it collapsed the way it did, in blood and a lot of grief. So my strong, wholehearted message to the European, watch it, keep it. It's a great project, 70 years of peace and commerce. And what it really means is, for instance, somebody told me way back when we were waiting at the borders, now it's a little bit better. A truck bearing goods from Vienna to Thessaloniki while Yugoslavia was still intact took less than a day. Now it takes between 4 and 7 days to get there. So you can imagine how much that costs and what a painful thing it is. Last but not least,
Thank you for your patience. It's a
Thank you
long
for
road to
yours.
come down. Thank you. No, it's great to be
We
here.
haven't even gotten to the Chinese guy,
I
the Turkish guy, the Russian
know.
guy.
It's hard, how do you sum up? So I think perhaps the best thing I can do as a think tank is to send out some new thoughts and some provoking thoughts. And Michael, I love the idea of the two-phase, the innovation. Here's my argument. I think we need to actually redefine the region and broaden it and make it more strategic. I was always inspired when, in 2001, when President Bush gave his famous Warsaw speech and was talking about NATO enlargement, and he said, we need to go from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and the collective government took this big intake of breath going, we can't do that, that's too big, that's too bold, that's too strategic in some ways. And I am always thinking this is what we need to do with Southeast Europe. We need to go from the Black Sea to the Eastern Mediterranean and make this region more strategic, more important. And by doing that, we then reprioritize the region strategically, both for Europe and for the United States. And I say that because we now have a twin challenge for this region. Exactly as Matt was saying, we have a diminishment of transatlanticism in this region. We have grown accustomed to managing for 25 years. We are busy with other pressing issues, either ourselves or other regions. And in that space, we've seen a rise of influence of those who are already in the region, certainly Russia first and foremost, but Turkey. And then we see the rise of new actors. China, I would argue also, the Gulf states are showing a bit more energy and enthusiasm. We're not the only game in town. So how do we restore transatlanticism and all of its manifestations back into the region? And I would argue we do that by focusing on the internal progress of the Western Balkans in the absence of NATO and EU membership. What we have learned from 15 years in Central Europe, it is vital and important, but it is insufficient for progress. In fact, if anything, there can be backsliding within these organizations, and we have no idea how to deal with that backsliding once it happens, hence sort of this two-phase approach. So I would argue we have to think about the external dynamic of influence and reinvest in transatlanticism in this strategic region, and then we have to focus on the internal progress. But to do so, I think we have to restate our strategic objectives here. We have lost the strategic thread over the last 25 years. US policy is about, well, EU membership, and NATO, of course, EU membership, but that's out of our control. How do we reprioritize? What do we want to do here? And this is where I think the land swap concept in the Serbia-Kosovo agreement sort of that re-question, wait, time, what are we doing here? What is the purpose here? So I think we restate, we want a successfully integrated region into Europe with multi-ethnic societies living together prosperously in a secure environment, I would argue within current borders. And this is where we get into a lot of questions about, do we start changing borders? Is that where we need to unstick, where we become stuck in the normalization process between Serbia and Kosovo? Is that how we improve a stagnant process in Bosnia for many, many years? But we have to be clear on what we want together. And then what we want, we have to make a massive reinvestment in this strategic region, diplomatically, of course, but also an investment of funds, not just for the government to government. We have been missing in civil society. We have been missing in helping work from the bottom up as we work from the top down. And I think we have to see this region much more strategically. So some thought-provoking ideas to shake up where we think about this region. If we think about this extending from the Black Sea in Ukraine, the March 31st Ukrainian presidential elections have ramifications and importance in Serbia, in Republic Srpska. We see these parallels together. We focus on that integration of that region together, and we really have a massive reinvestment in making sure this region does not move backwards as we are witnessing now Central Europe moving backwards. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. It's, yeah, the standard story of that part of the world is the frog in the well. 2 steps up and 1 down. It seems to be going, but on the whole, there is a lot of positive change in the attitude since we met each other 25 years ago, right?
Couldn't be much worse than it was back then.
Okay, even if we forget the hostilities, thank God they're behind us, and God forbid should they ever erupt again. But let's face it, it's always possible. But there's a lot of now drive for final consolidation of peace in the region. And they say, right now, at this stage, the key to peace and stability are the relations between Belgrade and Pristina at the moment. But in the long run, it is the relations between Serbia and Croatia, and of course the region in the economic for the sustainable development and security and progress in the long run. Right now, we heard today a couple of ideas, pros and cons about the land swap as the changing of borders. As I said, the way I see it, it is just one possible factor or one possible item, albeit a very important one. And yes, it could open a Pandora's box, although I agree with Ambassador Rees that this is a specific situation and should be treated as such, and sometimes we need to make some brave new decisions, maybe. I don't know. Smarter brains than mine should have a final verdict, and I think something soon will happen. But there is, all of a sudden, and I have to ask you that, the burning news in our part of the world is what happened yesterday, that the sources close to the talks, as reported by the Pristina press, they said that even the United States might pull out of Bonds deal because of Prime Minister's hard and eyes recalcitrance to drop the taxes.
If I may, Jovan, I'll address kind of the question you're getting at, but I'd also like to respond to something that Heather put on the table, and it's related to the same issue, which is this issue of land and land swaps and what the United States is or isn't doing. And I think there's some misperceptions or misunderstandings about the U.S. position with respect to this that I'd like to clarify. Heather, you talked about what it is that we're doing, what it is that we're pursuing. You know, we need to think about what we're trying to get out of this. And I think as we would look at it right now, the issue really is less what we're doing in these talks between Belgrade and Pristina, and more what they're going to do. That what we're trying to do is promote local ownership of this process. The Prespis agreement, the negotiations on Prespis succeeded in large part because it wasn't us. We weren't the drivers of this. It was owned by Skopje and Athens. It was the governments and the leaders on the two sides who took possession of this and negotiated the issues and found something that was agreeable to both, that they thought that they could sell to both sides. And that's a dynamic that we'd like to see replicated in these negotiations between Belgrade and Pristina. Local ownership. What is it that you need to do to reach an agreement that you feel you can sell to the Serbian public and you can sell to the Kosovo public? No red lines for us in these negotiations. Whatever it is you feel you need to negotiate to get an agreement, negotiate it. But no blank check. Bring us the agreement when you've reached it. If we have concerns about what you've agreed, we will articulate those concerns and see if we can work through them together. The issue of borders has assumed this kind of totemic significance in the negotiations, but for the United States, as we look at it, This is not a negotiations about borders. The centerpiece of this is recognition. This is about Kosovo recognizing Serbia. It is about Serbia recognizing Kosovo as a separate, independent, and sovereign nation, as a neighbor rather than a possession. That's the thing that will transform this region fundamentally. And then the question is, what is an agreement that has at its core, at its center, mutual recognition, and then what are the other aspects of this that are needed to support that core? And here I would agree with you, Jovan, that it's multidimensional. It's not just about where do you draw the line for the border between the two. It's security, it's trade, it's their cultural issues. There's a whole raft of issues and concerns that would need to be addressed. In terms of where the United States is coming from in our engagement with Kosovo on the issue of tariffs, the point here that I would make is, in order to get an agreement, you need negotiations. In order to get back to the negotiating table, the tariffs need to be removed. We would like to see the government of Kosovo remove the tariffs or suspend the tariffs that were put in place without consultation with us, without consultation with our other partners in the international community, tariffs that have become an obstacle to progress. This is important to the United States. The United States has given a lot to Kosovo over the years. The United States has helped and supported Kosovo over the years. And this is one of those times when we come to the government of Kosovo and we say, this is important to us. And here we expect Kosovo to respond like a partner. We haven't gotten the reaction out of the Kosovo authorities that we'd like to see. We're working to change the context in which those decisions are made, such that Prime Minister Haradinaj and the leadership in Kosovo on all sides comes to understand their self-interest as we would like them to, which is that on this issue, it is important for Kosovo to accommodate U.S. concerns, U.S. priorities, suspend the tariffs, and give this dialogue process a chance.
Thank you, Matt. I have a list of questions here. I don't think we need to go, I think we covered everything we need regarding this. We talked about Bosnia-Herzegovina. I see some good changes for the better coming out of after the recent elections. And I have to say I'm a little bit surprised, but it's good nice kind of surprise. The rhetorics, we've been accustomed to it, has been up and down, but on the whole, there is a dynamic there. There is another issue here that we can briefly touch base, is the return of the Daesh fighters. There is, according to security services, there is a lot of already their power base in Bosnia-Herzegovina that needs to be monitored very closely, obviously. But since we have 25 minutes and we haven't come to the Q&A, I would like to, and we talked about the migrants and everything, growing populism and nationalism also because of some disenchantment, Russian role, we've covered all that. Okay, now we have the situation of the membership in the EU stalled. And Dr. Ralph also mentioned something that's very interesting, Sir Michael as well. There has been, for a long time, an idea, some would have called it a pipe dream, of some sort of reorganization of the entire area, closer political ties, and I've been trying to be very diplomatic and very careful in how I word this. So it's not a Balkan association of countries or anything like that, but it's a sort of a bigger integration of economy, of institutions. Some even had an idea of having to constitute a Balkan parliament, West Balkan parliament. The idea was to show the European Union that the region is prepared for bigger steps, that it's reached mature adult age in politics and in economy. In another way, in another sense, we could look at the Scandinavian Scandinavian model of cooperation. Is that feasible? Because there's a lot of now drive, for instance, the Belgrade-Tirana highway and everything that it would bring, the Belgrade-Sarajevo highway. So what do you think about the highway? How much would it help? How much would it, what would it bring to the region?
So I was struck by the comment that politics is the sort of the counterpart of democracy, and that is really so true. Politics can be very loud, noisy, and risk-taking, but it really is the natural part. It has to be there. So in my opinion, roads and infrastructure, cooperation on infrastructure is useful. We already have a big network of cooperation in the security field, exercises amongst the different countries that they do together. There is a question, I think, if we really looked at it, about whether economic integration really works or whether it's really more of an engine to have integration with Western Europe. But I guess I wouldn't really leap at the idea of a regional parliament. I think that, along with Heather's point about taking a strategic perspective, that the theme of strengthening democratic institutions within the countries of the Western Balkans is what we really need to continue to look at. I realize this is old, think, and boring, but in order for politics to work, people have to have faith that those democratic institutions are working, that the rule of law is working. And where we all know demographically, the Western Balkans has a huge younger population, a huge younger generation, and one of the biggest challenges is them leaving the region. That what we need, those political parties, those democratic structures to have the confidence of those new young people. So I think infrastructure is helpful. It's symbolically useful. It has practical applications. When they put the road in down to the coast of Albania, suddenly we had tourists from other places than Albania and Kosovo going to the coast there, which is always useful. But in the most basic sense, I think if we on the outside are going to use our institutions and our influence to produce progress in the region, that we do need to keep a focus on building those democratic institutions that are the engines of progress in each of those countries and in the region as a whole.
Mr. President, you mentioned something about Russia, and we have seen the surge of Chinese investment in the region. Obviously, China has become a big player on the world scene to the point that some say within a year or two it will be the #1 economic force in the world. Certainly very quietly at the beginning, but also very steadily has invested in the region. Many people, we constantly talk about the road from the railway, fast railway from Thessaloniki, the purchase of the Thessaloniki port, and the fast railways to Budapest stuff. What will Chinese investments, what will the Turkish stream that also goes through Bulgaria do for the region? Some will argue that this dependence on Russian energy is making a hostage situation in Europe. What are your thoughts?
A lot of questions. Let me very briefly really touch on many of the issues we had, and once again thank you for this wonderful debate we have today. First of all, infrastructure, highways, gas pipelines, railways are happening in the Balkans. I was very proud to see all the leaders coming together, agreeing in Sofia on a Balkan connectivity master plan. We agreed, we signed it, and many of the sources could be Chinese investments, could be European Union investments, are now channeled in a way that makes sense, not just chaotically to build here and there some infrastructure, but to link the economies together and to come back together. And for example, now European Union 2 days ago agreed and signed 250 million euros a deal with Turkey of bringing a high-speed rail from Istanbul to the Bulgarian border through Edirne. But on the other side, that's this very same route, that's the Corridor 10, that further goes through Serbia, Belgrade, to Budapest. Part of this is going to be funded by Chinese investments, and it is the one and the same trade route and corridor. I find it very exciting. I'm not afraid about China building up its position in the Balkans with the 16+1. Serbia got $6.5 billion credit from China. That's a lot. Bosnia-Herzegovina just signed, I think, 2.5 billion. So China is building up, but China, in a way, respects very much, I would say, the European Union in an attempt not to undermine the importance of their biggest trading partner, and is very careful about what they do, especially here in Europe, as a very big difference to what Russia does. You might tell that Russia is using the gas transportation networks of making countries dependent on the way of Russian gas pipelines. You will see more oligarchs, more dependencies, probably more corruption, more and more and more instability, because the Russians might think they can use the gas as a weapon and not just a good to be traded on the stock exchange. But on the other side, the European Commission have shown strength, and you see what happened in the trade dispute, for example, with Gazprom. And just put all the others. The European Commission, I think it's amazingly strong regulator like probably no other in the world today. Just look at GDPR. There was no one else, not China, not Russia, not even the United States, of willing to regulate how the data of billions of people have been circulating in the network. And that's what the European Union has done with an amazing success. So coming back to those networks, they're nice, they're fine when they're part of a common plan of coming together. I enjoy very much, just 2 weeks ago I was skiing in Bansko, and I found a hotel which is called Dorint Hotel in Bansko, where the owner is a Turkish guy, the manager is a Greek guy, the cook is Serbian, there is a gypsy orchestra playing all the music and Bulgarian stuff. And I was really excited to see how people come together in an amazing way. And I find it very, very positive and very exciting if it continued this trend. Just another example, how the European Union works, and coming back to the European Union and NATO as the major factor for this region. 25 years ago, there was a city in Bulgaria called Ruse, and on the other side of Danube, there was a city, Giurgiu. Both cities just hated themselves, big time. There was a chemical factory on the one side and chemical factory of the other side, just poisoning themselves. And there was just protest after protest. It was a total disaster. And that was like this since centuries. And now, guess what happens with the integration of Bulgaria and Romania within the European Union? Georgia and Russia have a common spatial planning. They plan together. They become one city. Every day, people from Romania come to Bulgaria to buy cheap medicine, or people from Bulgaria go there to buy cheap food, but they come together, and guess what? They love it. They enjoy it big time. As people in this hotel in Bansko really enjoyed coming together. So only the sky is the limit. The Balkans are a wonderful, beautiful part of Europe, fully integrated in the very heart of the European continent. On the other side, the Balkans have always been the cheapest and the most efficient way to destabilize the Balkans big time. And because of that, every attempt for peacemaking, and here I see a friend and someone we should all congratulate and thank him for what he has done. as a peacemaking effort of historical importance. Very happy to see you, Mr. Minister. So back, a very important issue about the European Union. Now, the European Union, I'm not a federalist. I don't think this is going to fly. All those issues of a Balkan parliament, they're not going to fly. But the European Union is a unique project for peace. Peace is only possible when countries come together. I'm not saying that borders have to be forgotten, but what I'm trying to say is that my formula for the European Union, as being a very passionate European and Democrat, but not federalist, is a strong union of strong member states. And I have seen the European Union making Bulgaria much stronger. Because when Bulgaria was not a member of the European Union, it was just part of empires east of us playing geopolitical games of spheres of interest and periphery. I totally believe that the European Union makes Germany stronger, France stronger, Greece stronger, and will make Serbia stronger. And because of that, I believe that it works, and it's worth all the effort. On the other side, you need to have an ownership of the process. I've been talking so much to political leaders, for example, in Serbia, which I think is now the most important focus to all of us, to help, to give a hand, to solve, because they're really in a dire and difficult situation. But for example, Serbia, I don't think today, I travel there, I see, I talk to people, I don't think even Serbia today has a market economy. I can give you a lot of arguments. Is that true or not true? Some major, brave reforms in the Serbian economy are still not initiated. And the European Union is a union of market economies and, of course, rule of law and all the other issues. So there is a lot to be done from Serbia. There's a lot to be done by Bosnia-Herzegovina. We need to have an ownership of the process. And on the other side, of course, just to finish, Commissioner Hahn is a wonderful guy, amazing guy. I used to work with him when I was a minister. He was Commissioner of Regional Development. He has not just the most difficult job, but you don't want to be in his place, because as he was elected as a Commissioner for Enlargement, on the very same day, Jean-Claude Juncker said there is not going to be any enlargement for those 5 years. And of course, I don't think you don't do that. Just you don't do it. The European Union is coming back to the very core of what we are. It's a project for peace. It is bringing peace on the Balkans, and it should be more ambitious by integrating the countries in the region. There is a lot to be done in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. As I said, we could go on for a long time, and please, you want to say something?
If I may add
please.
something to the infrastructure. It's another new experience. It's my third seat here. Actually, I wanted to come back to the issue of infrastructure, because I think maybe over the last 20 years we somewhat underestimated the relevance of that. We focused a lot on capacity building, democratic rule of law, etc. And maybe because our infrastructure was fine, we thought we're past that. But when we experience the 3 Cs initiative, 16+1, and also the situation on the Western Balkans show us that a lot is about infrastructure. Actually, in Germany that even rhymes. Change through trade, Wandel durch Handel, is a core conviction of our policy. So we really believe in that. Enabling trade infrastructurally is something that can make political changes, processes change. So we have to work on that, and we're doing that. And the Berlin process for the Western Balkans is very much about that we try to enhance infrastructure and bring new momentum through that. At the same time, political decisions often happen at the margins, like business decisions. And it's sometimes frustrating to see that the European Union and the USA have invested so much in infrastructure, in development aid and so on, in very many regions of Eastern and Central and Southern Europe. And when the Chinese come in with relatively small sums, or the Russians, these actions at the margins gain so much traction. But that's gratitude is not a category in politics, but it's somewhat dispiriting to see that they can move so much in the political debate and the orientation with so little input. So we as Europeans and Americans probably have to be better to market and emphasize what our core contributions to the development of the respective countries are.
Thank you very much. The musical chairs.
There's enough for us.
We're really running out of time. I would like to go into Q&A. I just want to share in support what President Benitez said. After Dayton, I had the wonderful opportunity to be there, cover the talks for Reuters as a reporter. And I landed, and the second day, I was in Belgrade. We were waiting to see what Milosevic is going to do with the Bosnian Serbs and get them on board. And somebody called up, you might want to go to the Arizona route. That is a route between Serb-held Brčko territory and Tuzla, a Muslim town. There was a wall there was barriers, there was a front line. What's going on? So something is going on. They're meeting up. So that was a very big deal at that moment. So we packed up, hightailed it there, and all of a sudden there was this new construction. It was obviously a restaurant, and it said, how could you translate that? Two brothers, let's say. Složna braća, which means brothers in agreement. I'm making a very bad translation here. And there was a marketplace. All of a sudden, a big marketplace. Within a week, that marketplace was about 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. And one day we saw a truck full of pigs going in the direction of Tuzla, which the Serbs always said it was a Muslim town. I said, wait a minute, what are the pigs going? Well, that's Bosnia. That's what happens when people come together. And the trade went off. Even before the politicians started talking, the average Joe Bosnian started trading and meeting other people. And by the way, the restaurant was always packed 24/7 because families and friends started meeting up after 4 years of awful war and bloodshed like every other war is. Now,
Jovan, before we continue, could I just jump in briefly?
Yeah, sure.
Just to note that we've been joined by two of the principal architects of the PRESPA agreement. Absolutely. But, you know, while we're all talking about the region and the problems and what we should do about it, these are two individuals who did something about it. And just to recognize that, to honor them.
congratulations.
We've called it the single most significant purely diplomatic achievement in the region since the Dayton Accords. I believe that to be true, and I don't believe we would have gotten there without you two.
We have a saying that it takes courage to fight a war, but it takes heroism to conquer your own. Q&A? Any questions, please?
Shut
I have no idea, but
You can use mine, Mike.
Yeah, you want to come up here?
we're getting used to the musical chairs.
Get on my chair.
Yeah. Right over here.
Super panel. My name is Mike Haltzel. I'm chairman of the Transatlantic Leadership Network in Washington. Two very quick points. My friend Heather Conley made a great point about thinking strategically about the region in order to make it really transatlantic. And I agree, but I would just say the precondition for transatlantic solidarity starts at the top. And as long as we have leaders, and I begin with the leader of my country, who act in a transactional populist way, it's going to be very difficult to rekindle the spirit, the Wertegemeinschaft, as the Germans would say, the community of values. Secondly, Mr. Chairman, you said that the possible border arrangement between Serbia and Kosovo is specific and should be viewed as such. I think the key words are should be. I agree with you, it should be. Unfortunately, Milorad Dodik, the people in Vetvendosia and Kosovo, some hotheads in North Macedonia, and most importantly, and Dodik above all, and Vladimir Putin, who would certainly look at it as a precedent for Luhansk, Donetsk, Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia. As long as they don't agree with you that it should be, then I think we have real problems.
I agree. It is a problem, but as I said, it's for finer minds than mine to resolve. Thank you. Yes, please.
Okay, my name is Ioannis Nomikos. I'm the director of the Research Institute for European American Studies. I have a very short question. Regarding Southeastern Europe, I believe that the level of corruption is a systemic problem there. And the national security threat which threatens the cohesion of the societies and the investment development in the Balkan state. How do you think about that? I think corruption is the biggest problem to the integration of the Western Balkan into any international organization, including the EU.
Can I take that one?
Yes, please. Go.
Thank you
very much for that.
I thank you so much, and I think this gets back to Marcy's point on democratic institutions. This is not a challenge simply for the Western Balkans, although it's particularly acute. I would argue corruption is the cancer of Western democracies right now in the United States and across Europe. This is how we have allowed adversaries in some ways to exploit our own weaknesses within our institution. My center has done a lot of work looking at how Russian economic influence can be quite corrosive, but it's not simply that. Money laundering, and then it opens up an entire illicit basket, whether it's human trafficking and weapons and things like that. But this is not about those that are exploiting it. It's about strengthening our own institutions. This is why it's really a call to civil society. We need to work this problem top down, and we haven't been very successful at it top down. We need to start working from it from bottom up. That's why investigative journalists are dying in Europe, because they are reporting on corruption. This is the great battle, I think, of democracies right now, and one of the primary battle spaces are in the Western Balkans. We can restore trust, I think, with the people, that they understand that they have clean, effective government, and that is true for every one of our countries in this room.
Here. Ambassador?
I think a good way to look at this is in terms of two models. On one side, we have a democratic model that's anchored in institutions, the rule of law, and elections. And on the other side, we have what I would call the oligarchic or even feudal model, where loyalties to people, the exchange of money, favors, is what keeps things moving. And what we're obviously trying to do is have everyone make the choice on the one side, but we certainly have going on in the Western Balkans a whole set of these oligarchic or feudal networks. So I think it's useful to pose it as this choice. And this choice has to be made, and it has to be made firmly for those democracies to work.
Thank you. If I might briefly, I think, it's an interesting question. Are the Balkans corrupt, and is that a problem? Yes and yes. But maybe a more interesting question would be a structural one. How does corruption operate in the Western Balkans, and what can you do about it? And here the one point that I would make is what looks to me like the particular nature of corruption in much of the Western Balkans is that we're looking here at states that are in many ways partyocracies. They are run by and for the benefit of political parties, and political parties control much too much of the flow of goods and services in a society. They are sources of patronage. People look to parties for jobs. They look to parties for benefits. They look to parties to help them get a phone line. And this system has to be broken. And the core to that, I would argue, is to privatize state-owned enterprises and get the governments and the political parties out of the business of running the economy.
This is what we need to do, especially in the Balkans, is shore up institutions. Everything is beyond institutions, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Talking about corruption, let me share with you my my own experience. Honestly, I never planned, I never wanted to become a president of Bulgaria. Never. I never learned, I never had the ambition. I was not fighting for that, and it was not in my agenda at all. But what happened, and I'm really honest with you, European funds for Bulgaria have been frozen back in 2007-8 because of corruption. Then I became a minister, and I was trying to unlock as quickly, as efficiently as possible those funds. I went to Brussels, and I said, listen. And they said, there is no trust. Okay, there is a way to increase trust, and even to bring it from 0 to 100% very quickly. it depends on any politician to work for trust and bring solutions, how people could trust more. So what I've done, I invited the world leading anti-corruption institution, which is Transparency International, to run the public tenders of our ministry for the highways and railways and underground of Sofia. As a result of this, I became so popular in Bulgaria that political parties, even not a member, I've never been a member of any political party, they couldn't resist supporting me, so finally I ended up being a president. I'm telling you this story because I truly believe it depends on any one of us to address corruption, fight corruption. It is possible. There are very clear solutions about that, and the results could be seen. And just look at Estonia, for example, with the e-government. You can fight corruption by just making public money the way you run them transparent. And transparency pays off. Look at, for example, Estonia, how they managed to achieve that. And again, yes, an amazingly important issue for Greece, for Bulgaria, for all of us. And it depends on all of the politicians to really bring results.
One more question, please. Sorry. No, I don't think so.
Thank you very much. My name is Khagani. I'm from Iran. And obviously, EU did a hard work to get this nuclear agreement in place, which was very good. And I would like to ask the panel, because corruption is also an issue that we are facing in Iran, but that is due to sanctions, because sanctions corrupt all the politicians, business people, because they want to bypass it either in Europe, in USA, and elsewhere. Regretfully, in Iran, hardliners are gaining hands again, and in Washington, D.C., hardliners are also sitting behind the wheels, and we may witness a war soon, and how EU can play its role to prevent it. Thank you.
We'll take one more, and then we'll answer. 1 minute, we gotta go.
Yeah, I'm Vasily Gavril from the Russian embassy here in Athens, Counselor. You complained here that Russia was not on the panel, and you always say that Russia fills the vacuum. Yeah. Let me just, I think you would allow me a few comments after what was said here.
2 minutes, please. Otherwise, I will be sacrificed at the altar of the oracle. I've been told 10 times to keep it to the limit, and I will. So I'm sorry that you took the floor so late. But yes, please.
One minute.
Please.
Concerning the Russian gas, we know that it's competitive, and the prices are very good and attractive to EU member states, and we don't have to impose our gas on European member states and to put political pressure to attain this goal. First, concerning the Balkans, Russia does not interfere in the developments in the Balkans, and we did not try to undermine the Prespas agreement, but we clearly offered our position and our assessments of the negotiations process and the ratification process, and it was not the Russian ambassador present at the parliament in Skopje during the voting on the constitutional amendments. It was not Mr. Lavrov, President Putin, visiting Skopje before the referendum, urging the citizens of the country to make the right choice during the referendum, and so on. And we hear a lot of accusations, but frankly speaking, we see it as an attempt to cover the real interference into the developments in the Balkans. Thank you. That was my point.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that you didn't stand up a little bit earlier so we could comment on that. Now, on that merry note, thank you very much. It's been a privilege, and I think I got away with my life. But thank you. Thank you very, very much.